Okay, picture this. Saturday, September 27th, 2025. The president makes this extraordinary declaration. Portland, Oregon, war ravaged, federal buildings, under siege by, quote, Antifa and other domestic terrorists.
It sounds like something out of a movie, honestly.
Right, and it wasn't just talk, it came with an immediate order, send in troops.
A really significant step.
But here's where it gets really strange, based on the sources we looked at. That very same morning in Portland, journalists are describing a totally different city.
Uh-huh.
Packed farmers markets, people out jogging along the river, and the ICE facility, the one supposedly under siege.
Yeah. What about it?
On the ground, reports found 4 protesters. Just 4.
4 people. Not exactly a siege.
The gap between those two realities is just huge.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Welcome to the deep dive. And you're right, the complexity here is, well, it's intense. We're looking at a collision course involving executive power, some fundamental constitutional law, and frankly, modern information warfare.
We've got a lot of material here, legal documents, news reports, official statements. Exactly. So our mission for you today is to really break down these conflicting stories surrounding the Portland ICE facility incident in September 2025. We need to analyze the specific legal moves, the military mechanisms the federal government pointed to.
And understand how the rhetoric, the words themselves, might have actually created the crisis it claimed it was solving.
That's the core of it. Did the narrative drive the reality?
So let's start with that first trigger, the president's social media announcement on Saturday, the 27th. It was incredibly strong language.
Full force if necessary. That phrase really stood out.
Yeah, ordering troops against facilities supposedly under siege. And the justification came fast.
They framed it immediately as a lawful response, didn't they? Protecting federal property, federal personnel.
And they specifically mention months of violent riots, linking it back to the protests in 2020.
Right, constructing a history, a kind of predicate, to make this action seem necessary, even if the immediate situation didn't warrant it. But the language itself is so crucial.
Calling protesters Antifa and other domestic terrorists.
Especially after Antifa had been formally designated a domestic terrorist organization. That labeling, it elevates everything. It takes it from a potential local policing issue.
Right into the realm of national security, almost like an act of war.
Precisely. It changed the whole frame.
And what about that specific phrase, full force, if necessary? You said it stood out. Does it actually mean anything in military terms?
Well, that's the interesting part. According to the sources, no. It doesn't have a standard definition in U.S. military doctrine or rules of engagement.
So it's just rhetoric.
It seems designed to be political. It signals a really aggressive maximalist stance. The likely intent. Intimidate protesters, local residents, maybe even state officials.
Suggesting a willingness to go beyond normal limits.
Exactly. And this wasn't happening in a vacuum, was it?
The sources point out this felt like a pattern.
A playbook, as some call it. We saw similar federal actions in Los Angeles back in June 2025 and in Washington, D.C. too.
So using this kind of federal force against a city run by Democrats
becomes a political strategy. You manufacture, or at least heavily exaggerate, a crisis narrative. And that narrative then becomes the justification you need for taking extraordinary action, using these specific legal authorities.
Which contrasts so sharply with what people in Portland were actually experiencing that day.
Right. The view from the ground completely undercut the war-ravaged narrative.
We found some telling anecdotes in the sources, like a 72-year-old resident hearing the news and just calling it disgusting.
Yeah, and the person just taking a leisurely stroll by the river, calling the president's statement ridiculous.
It really speaks to that local feeling that this whole crisis was being, well, fabricated.
And the official claim about the ICE facility being under siege just didn't hold up to scrutiny.
4 protesters. Multiple reports confirmed that number for Saturday morning.
And local law enforcement kept insisting, we have this under control.
So the White House narrative wasn't just an exaggeration. It seems fundamentally disconnected from the facts on the ground at that moment.
Which led to a pretty immediate public reaction. Right.
Oh, yeah. It was fascinating. Indignation mixed with a lot of online mockery. That hashtag #WarRavagePortland, took off almost instantly.
It's like a collective digital fact check, but using humor.
People posting pictures of, peaceful parks, busy breweries, farmers markets.
Using social media to directly counter the official government story in real time. That kind of immediate grassroots pushback is really significant in shaping public perception.
It immediately framed the federal action as potentially unnecessary, even absurd.
And the political leaders in Oregon, they were
Yeah.
just as quick and clear.
Governor Tina Kotek, Mayor Keith Wilson, they were completely united. They rejected the whole premise for federal troops.
Kotek said point blank, no insurrection, no threat to national security, therefore, no need for military troops.
And Mayor Wilson, I think he said the number of federal troops Portland needed was
0. Very direct.
What's really revealing, though, is that detail about Governor Kotek trying to talk to the president beforehand.
Yeah, that failed 7-minute phone call just before the order was formally issued.
It suggests the decision was already made, regardless of what local officials or the facts on the ground were saying.
Which basically guaranteed this would end up in court. It set the stage for a constitutional fight.
And that fight kicked off almost immediately. Sunday, September 28th, the Department of Defense makes it official.
Formalizing the order, federalizing 200 Oregon National Guard members for 60 days.
Using Title 10 authority, specifically 10 U.S.C. Section 12406.
And that specific authority is key here.
Because using Title 10 meant the president took command of those state guard members away from the governor.
Exactly. It's a federal takeover of state assets against the state's wishes. That's a major flashpoint in federal-state relations.
Which is why Oregon and Portland didn't waste any time. They filed that big 41-page federal lawsuit.
And sought a temporary restraining order, a TRO, trying to block the deployment before it really started.
The legal stakes here feel enormous. What were the core arguments Oregon was making?
They really zeroed in on 2 huge constitutional issues. The first was the 10th Amendment.
Okay, the 10th Amendment that reserves powers to the states, right? How did they apply it here?
They argued it was unconstitutional commandeering. Basically, that the federal government was seizing state police powers.
Because the mission was essentially public safety, crowd control.
Precisely. Oregon argued that policing protests, maintaining public order, those are core state responsibilities. For the feds to swoop in and take over the Guard for that purpose was, in their view, a direct violation of the 10th Amendment's division of power.
Okay, that's one pillar. What was the second big legal argument?
The Posse Comitatus Act. This is the law that generally forbids using the U.S. military for domestic law enforcement.
Right, but isn't there usually an exception for protecting federal property? How did Oregon deal with that?
They tackled it head-on. They acknowledged the exception, but argued the mission here risked crossing that line.
Especially with that vague, full-force authorization.
Exactly. And given the situation, the deployment itself was creating more protests, they argued the Guard's role would inevitably slide from just guarding a building into prohibited activities like crowd control, surveillance of citizens, maybe even arrests.
That line between property protection and domestic policing can be really blurry.
It's notoriously thin. Oregon's lawsuit aimed to convince the court that this deployment was clearly stepping over into the prohibited side.
And they weren't just arguing this in isolation, were they? They referenced another recent case.
Yes, they leaned heavily on an initial ruling in a similar California case, Newsom v. Trump. In that case, a judge had already found that a similar federal deployment did violate the Posse Comitatus Act.
So it suggests a strategy, maybe across multiple states, to use the courts to push back against this kind of federal action.
It looks like an attempt to build legal precedent to prevent this playbook from becoming the new normal, using past rulings to draw clear lines for the future.
Which brings us to maybe the biggest irony of this whole situation, the self-fulfilling prophecy aspect.
It's really striking, isn't it?
The president's announcement on Saturday, warning of a siege. That announcement was the very thing that turned Sunday's protest from 4 people into several hundred.
Absolutely. The federal action didn't respond to a crisis. It seems to have generated one. The administration's narrative became the catalyst for the very scene it claimed to be reacting to.
And the crowd that showed up on Sunday, it wasn't the same group, was it?
No. The sources describe it as much more diverse. Families, older people, kids, even spouses of veterans.
And crucially, what were they protesting?
Many weren't primarily there about immigration or the ICE facility itself. They were protesting the deployment.
Seeing it as government overreach, a violation of rights, one organizer apparently called the deployment a moral injury.
So the federal rhetoric actually unified the opposition and gave them a potent rallying cry. They weren't just protesting federal policy, they were protesting the federal narrative and the federal presence.
And while things were mostly peaceful, there were those minor clashes. Federal agents used pepper balls.
Which, in a way, confirmed the risk. The presence of the federal force, deployed under this charged atmosphere, created the friction and potential for the exact kind of conflict the administration claimed it was there to prevent.
It really underscores the importance of historical context here, too. This wasn't the first federal intervention in Portland.
Not at all, and that's critical. The events of 2025 immediately brought back memories of the controversial 2020 federal deployment.
Where agents in unmarked vehicles clashed with protesters, and local officials strongly argued that the federal presence actually escalated the violence back then.
Right. That 2020 experience created this deep, pre-existing mistrust. It's why local leaders and activists could react so quickly in 2025.
They saw the same pattern?
They saw the 2020 playbook being run again, and they mobilized instantly based on that collective memory and suspicion.
So the whole incident, it really becomes more than just a protest or a deployment.
It becomes a major stress test for American federalism, the balance of power between Washington, D.C. and the states. And it's a stark example of information warfare, where the main battle isn't physical, it's over the definition of reality itself.
You have the president's political narrative clashing head-on with the reality reported locally.
And that unified resistance from Oregon, using lawsuits, using social media, using public statements, it was all aimed at defending their version of reality and their state's rights against that federal narrative.
So wrapping this up, what's the key takeaway for you, the listener, from all this? Based on the sources we've dug into, this Portland deployment really looks less like a response to an existing crisis.
And much more like the cause of one. The action seems rooted in a political narrative, a kind of fiction.
That was immediately contradicted by the facts on the ground and challenged fiercely in the courts on basic constitutional grounds. 10th Amendment, Posse Comitatus.
Yeah, and that swift legal and public pushback from Oregon shows this system has ways to resist. But it also throws a spotlight on how fragile, maybe, our shared understanding of facts can be in the modern political environment.
The administration used the power to define a situation, calling a city war-ravaged, to justify expanding its own power.
Which leaves us with a really crucial and maybe unsettling final thought for you to consider. Given this kind of disconnect between rhetoric and documented reality, how do we, as a democratic society, actually agree on a set of verifiable facts? Especially when the very definition of what constitutes a crisis becomes maybe the most potent political weapon an executive branch has.
That is definitely something to chew on regarding the future of federal power. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the source material on the federal deployment in Portland.
We absolutely encourage you to keep exploring these issues, particularly the ongoing debates around the Posse Comitatus Act and Title X authority.